Hi, everybody. Tonight we have Jayson Gill with us. Mr. Gill attended Metropolitan State University of Denver for his undergraduate, where he majored in anthropology, graduating summa cum laude. He went on to receive a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Connecticut. Currently, he is a PhD candidate at the University of Connecticut in the Department of Anthropology's Old World Archaeology program. The focus of his doctoral research is the Lower to Middle Paleolithic transition, in Eurasia, and the application of 3D scanning and geometric morphometrics to questions of human behavioral evolution. Since 2014, he has been excavating Pleistocene-aged sites in the Republic of Armenia as part of an international team of archaeologists, geologists, and volcanologists. Outside of Armenia, he works with collections from the United Kingdom that are housed at the British Museum. His experience in archaeology also includes resource management work in the American Southwest and New England. Thanks, Jayson. Welcome.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me. Let me get my slides up here. All right, someone just let me know quickly if you guys can see that.
I can see it.
Okay, great. So yeah, thanks for having me here tonight. So I'm going to be discussing a number of ongoing and past projects by my research team in the Republic of Armenia dealing with the Pleistocene Archaeological Record. Right. So as a brief overview of what I'm going to be discussing today, I'm going to start off with a chronology, just a really basic, simple chronology of Eurasia during the Pleistocene, so we're all in the same place in terms of what we're actually talking about. I'll then move on to discussing the landscape setting in Armenia, very particularly how it's kind of unique and how that impacts our understanding of hominin habitation here. I will briefly comment on the nature of the Pleistocene record in the Southern Caucasus, very much kind of pre-1990s and the gaps that it leaves us. I'll then move on to a discussion of the Transcaucasian Expedition project, so our research team, our past projects, and I'm going to focus in on two different sites here, Norgary 1, in which I'm going to talk about technological change during the Pleistocene, and then I'll move on to talking about a site called Hatis 1 and how it helps us fill in some gaps in the Pleistocene record in this region. I'll end the talk by a look to the future of Armenian research with kind of our ongoing projects right now and some future projects that are coming up by our team and some other teams that we closely work with. So here on this slide, what we're seeing is a very simplified, overgeneralized breakdown of the chronology here in Eurasia, looking at kind of these geological epochs, a very, very badly drawn climate record, some of the archaeological periods in terms of the named technological periods, some of the lithic industries that work as somewhat of, I guess, type fossils, if you will, for these archaeological periods, with some pictures of what those might look like. And then on the side of the screen here, we have a very simplified hominin family tree to kind of also help us understand maybe where we're talking about in terms of human evolution. So if we see now, hopefully you guys can see this area highlighted in red, what most of our research has focused on for the better part of the last decade is the Middle Pleistocene and the Late Pleistocene, looking at the kind of end of the Lower Paleolithic period and into the Middle Paleolithic technological period, looking at things like Late Acheulian and kind of Lavawa and Mousterian, if you will, technologies through these periods. Right, anywhere from talking about Homo erectus through Neanderthals and early modern humans. In recent years, we have somewhat shifted our focus, though, to talk about earlier periods, very particularly moving back into the early Pleistocene, kind of talking about some of the earliest Lower Paleolithic record and Basal Paleolithic record, if you will, looking at things like Oldowan-styled core and flake technology. We also do dabble a little bit in the Upper Paleolithic to a lesser extent. So here we see this smaller red circle here, which is really the focus of my dissertation research and my interests, is looking at the very, very end of the Lower Paleolithic and the very beginning of the Middle Paleolithic, and trying to understand how we get from one technological period to the next, how we get this technological change throughout Eurasia during this transitional period. And what I'm talking about really, to simplify it here, is I'm talking about going from Acheulian hand axe assemblages, here noted as A, to Lavawa or other prepared core technologies here denoted C, how we get from one to the other. And if you're not familiar with what Acheulian hand axe technology is, right, we have this picture up in which we see all of these kind of flakes of debitage removed from this objective piece, the hand axe. So it's all of this shaping to try and get this larger objective piece tool. And then when we get into the Middle Paleolithic, this is largely replaced by prepared core technologies, in which we see the same kind of shaping strategies, but instead of getting that objective piece, the hand axe, the tool, right, they're shaped so that then you can remove a piece of debitage of a specific size and specific shape, right, the Lavawa flake or the prepared flake. So this is kind of the questions that keep me up at night in terms of what I'm interested in, and trying to understand, right, how do we get from one to the other? And I'll return to this when we talk about the site of Norgary 1. I just wanted to put it kind of front and center in everyone's minds. So if we turn to the region that we're talking about the Southern Caucasus or Transcaucasia. Here we have a red line showing where the Greater Caucasus Range runs here in this part of the world. Everything to the south of the Greater Caucasus demarcation is part of the Southern Caucasus, so Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan in particular, but also parts of Turkey and Iran, and the ethnically Armenian Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh inside Azerbaijan. And it's called the Lesser Caucasus or the Southern Caucasus because it skirts around the Lesser Caucasus mountain range. Now, this area is really important for our understanding of human evolution and human migration. It's often referred to as a pathway or a crossroads between areas like Africa, the Levant, and Eurasia. We will be focusing in on Armenia particularly here, but really the record of this whole region is really important to contextualizing what's happening in Armenia. So a little bit more about the landscape and the area that we're discussing. Something that really heavily defines Pleistocene period in Armenia is the volcanic activity here. Right. There are several phases of volcanic eruptions that are of relevance to our discussion of Pleistocene habitation during this period. Now, there's far more periods of volcanic eruptions in Armenia, in the whole region, than what I've listed here, but these are of particular interest to the study of the Pleistocene, especially for kind of the Lower Paleolithic and Middle Paleolithic periods, looking at the ones after 1 million years ago. And then in terms of what we also get from this volcanic activity, we get a lot of obsidian formation that comes after 1 million years ago. And I'm mostly focusing in on central Armenia here, where a lot of our work has been done. But this is all very characteristic of central Armenia. And here, let's see if I can get the laser pointer to work. We have a close-up of an obsidian outcrop We have some pebble obsidian in this picture. In this upper picture, we have some basalt outcropping out of the ground. In this middle photo, we have a basaltic flow sitting on top of a geological section. And then we have this ash layering in this lower picture. So this whole central Armenian landscape is really heavily defined by the volcanic activity. And just to really give you a sense of the scale of this volcanic activity, here's a map from Sheriff et al. 2019, in which we have all of these quaternary volcanoes mapped in this central Armenian location close to the capital. Right, so all of these triangles are volcanically active during the Pleistocene or Holocene periods. Right, and this obsidian is really an important resource from this volcanic activity for toolstone for the hominins here. If you've ever worked with flint-napped obsidian, then you know the ease in which it's napped and the sharpness of the edge of it once it's snapped. It makes a really great toolstone, and it's plenty abundant, especially during the late Pleistocene. We also have other volcanic materials that are used by the hominins during the Pleistocene, such as different qualities of basalt and andesite that we see used. And of course, you've got other materials in the region, mudstones, sandstones, cherts, that are used, but especially to a much lesser extent in central Armenia during the Pleistocene period. So if we turn our attention to obsidian and what it can tell us more than just tool use, because of all of this abundant obsidian, we can actually comment on land use and mobility patterns of the hominins using this area. Because different obsidians from different volcanic eruptions have specific elemental properties that through portable X-ray fluorescence analysis, we can actually pinpoint what volcanoes the hominins were going to collect their toolstone. Right, and this is something you see here in this photo. Dr. Ellery Fromm from Yale, this is what he's using. He's using a PXRF machine. And in this figure here, you can see some of the named volcanoes in the region and sourcing data for them, showing that they do have unique signatures when we use this methodology. So thankfully, Ellery's done a lot of hard work going and sourcing all of the natural obsidian outcrops so that we're able to comment on where hominins are getting their toolstone. He's also developed a rock magnetic characterization approach, which is what we see happening here in pictures A and B, that allow us to comment to some extent on where within a certain outcrop these hominins are getting their toolstone, whether it's a primary outcrop or something like a secondary deposit of nodules in a river. We can get at some of those questions too with his methods. And if this was something that you were interested in, Ellery's very well published in this, and I would highly recommend taking a look at his research. So I also want to comment on the waterways, because for our research, kind of the hydrology of the region is just as important as kind of the volcanology of the region, especially how the two interact. So a lot of our research has taken place in what's called the Razdan Gorge, which is highlighted here in red, running down past the capital of Yerevan there in green. Now, during the Pleistocene, this wouldn't have been running where it is, thanks to a lot of hard geological work by Keith Wilkinson, Jenny Sheriff, and others. We know that it would have been running further to the west, but a lot of our sites that we have around the Razdan Gorge are in the floodplain of what would have been the river at the time, or are on tributaries of that river during the Pleistocene, giving them a rich alluvial environment to subsist within. Now, another thing that all of this volcanic activity causes in this region is that this river gets dammed by basaltic lava flows multiple times throughout the Pleistocene, creating essentially large lakes through this damming effect that then later on get broken and it turns back into a river. So there's also, at times, there's a paleolacustrine environment for hominins to subsist within. In recent years, we've turned our attention to the north here, to what is called the Deadbed Valley, looking at a number of different sites up there that I'll talk about later. And here's just a shot of the modern day Razdan Gorge and what it looks like kind of in the locations in which we're working. It's a very deeply cut gorge, and you can see some of this basaltic lava outcropping in the edges of it. So if we turn our attention to the Pleistocene Caucasus prior, especially, this whole area was part of the Soviet Union at that time, and part of kind of the Soviet mandate, and the research mandates really focused on the Bronze Age and later time periods, much younger time periods, leaving the Pleistocene heavily unstudied or understudied. There are sites that were recovered to some extent during this period. Many of those went undated, or the dates are difficult to align with the archaeology that was recovered. There's questionable context. There's a lot of surface material recovered. Many of the excavated sites went unpublished or have very, very brief publications to them. Much of that material is either missing or the contextual information is missing. And this leaves us with not quite a deep understanding at all of what much of the Pleistocene looks like in terms of hominin occupations and hominin behaviors. So we don't really understand the techno-typological patterns or the other chronological patterns of behavior from this earlier period of research. Now, our research group, the Transcaucasian Expedition, we're an international collaboration of multiple universities and multiple disciplines, working in close connection with archaeologists from the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. And here I've listed some of our major projects from essentially the last decade or so. A major one being the Razdan Gorge Paleolithic project, in which you can see this cluster of sites here. That is where the Razdan Gorge is. Many of these sites are related to that project. There's also a lot of geological work that went into this project, a lot of mapping and recreation of the Pleistocene landscape to give us that rich landscape context for hominin occupations. The second project here kind of just pushed that further, trying to better understand especially landscape formation, along with the archaeological record here. And then this last one I mentioned here, the early to late Pleistocene settlement project, is something we're currently working on up here in northern Armenia. So here I've labeled two sites, Norgari 1 and Hatis 1. These are the two sites I'm going to jump a little bit more in depth into, especially with Hatis 1 and to a lesser extent Norgari 1, and how they can help us understand the Pleistocene a little better. So here's probably what is an overly convoluted timeline that I've constructed and placed some of our sites within. We have time moving across the bottom of the screen from the Lower Paleolithic through the Upper Paleolithic Younger period, and within each of those periods we also have time moving from the bottom of the screen to the top of the screen. While I wish I had the time to go over each one of these sites in detail, I'm sure you guys don't want to be here for 7 or 8 hours, so I'll just briefly move through them. But we have Solok 1 here in the Upper Paleolithic. It's really one of our only Upper Paleolithic projects in Armenia. We currently don't have a date on it, but technologically speaking, it belongs in the Upper Paleolithic. Here in the Middle Paleolithic, we have these 3 different sites, Alapars, Barosh, and Lusakert. And while they're all important, I do believe Lusakert is very important because it is a very dense hominin occupation that not only do we actually have tools from, but we also have animal remains from, which is actually quite rare in Armenia due to the acidity of the soil caused by all this volcanic input. So Lusakert 1 tells us a lot about more than just the technology here. We also have really great evidence for controlled use of fire at the site. due to Alexander Brittingham's work on polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons recovered from the soils. And then here in the Lower Paleolithic, we have Norgary 1, and this is something I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, so I'm going to leave off on that for now. But we can start filling in other parts of this timeline by work done by some of our colleagues, putting more sites here in the Middle and Upper Paleolithic. And we can also add sites from Georgia. Here we have Ortvaloclidae, which has both Middle Paleolithic strata and Upper Paleolithic strata. And it's a well-researched site. Of course, we can also add more Georgian sites like Dmanisi, which you may be familiar with, is the most well-studied, oldest site outside of Africa at 1.8 million years ago, with plentiful Homo erectus remains and tool technology that's quite like the old Awan core and flake technology. We can also fill in some more of these gaps with other Georgian sites from north of Armenia. We can put the site Azak Cave here as well, which is in Nogaro-Karabakh. That has Middle Paleolithic layers, but it also does have Lower Paleolithic deposits that aren't quite well dated or understood. But importantly, those Lower Paleolithic layers do contain a hominin mandible that has been described as either Neanderthal or Homo heidelbergensis, depending on the researcher who's reporting on it. So that's a site that does warrant some more attention in the future. But of course, what we're missing here is a big gap in the Lower Paleolithic record of Armenia. And there are sites I can throw in here in the Lower Paleolithic, but I've left them out for a number of reasons, and I'll touch on some of those reasons when we get to Hatis 1. And there's other sites I could throw in some of these other periods, but I've left them out for one reason or another. There is a new site that kind of falls around this time of Lucicurt, which I didn't include because it just came out in publication last week, and I have not had time to read about it. So now I want to turn our attention to the site of Norgary 1 in central Armenia on the Razdan Gorge. But to do that, I want to first kind of go over a few hypotheses with you about that idea of technological change I mentioned at the beginning. And the reason I want to do this is because Norgary 1 helps us comment on how we get technological change in this region particularly. So I want to talk about the ideas people have had about how we get especially Middle Paleolithic technology like lava flaking outside of Africa. So the first hypothesis that I want to mention, and these are gross oversimplifications of these, and then there's a lot of variations of these ideas, but this idea is usually kind of thought of as the null hypothesis, or it's treated as such for how we get lava flaking technology arriving outside of Africa. So in this scenario, we see lava technology invented in one region of Africa, and then with migrating hominin groups, it moves into all the other regions of Africa and then into Eurasia, the rest of the so-called Old World, creating a turnover event that suggests not just technological turnover, but also biological turnover. And this has important ramifications for our understanding of human evolution during this period, and especially our understanding of Neanderthal ancestry and how Neanderthals evolve in Eurasia during the Middle Paleolithic. So the alternative hypothesis to this, how we get Middle Paleolithic lava-like technologies outside of Africa, is the polycentric hypothesis or the transition hypothesis, which states that in many regions in both Africa and outside of Africa, independently of each other, you see technological convergence of this kind of technology and this innovation based on a shared technological ancestry, that is the Acheulian. They're all using the Acheulian in these different places, and somehow this lava technology is therefore embedded in the Acheulian, and different people are able to invent the same technology in different places. Now, this doesn't completely disregard migration and diffusion playing a role in how this spreads, as the proliferation would need some migration and diffusion to understand how it spreads all over the Old World. But it does look at kind of their origins very differently. Now, this scenario also has ramifications for our understanding of human evolution as well, as this allows for in situ development of technology, and therefore evolution of MP hominins like Neanderthals. So with these two hypotheses in mind, I want to now turn to Norgary 1. And this is what we're seeing in this picture. We're seeing the site. We're looking at it from the eastern side of the Razdan Gorge, looking west. And the original Razdan Gorge, or the Razdan River, would have been running further to the west in the background here, and the site is in what would have been the floodplain of that river during occupation. And if we look at this, we have what we have labeled as lava that sits below the sediments at the site, and it kind of creates this bowl shape in which is then infilled by sediments. And then we have above the sediments at the site, we have what's called lava 1 here that caps those sediments and protects those sediments from erosional forces. So the site's quite well preserved. And the sediments themselves, we have some lacustrine kind of lake deposits down low, and then we have these alluvial channel and stream action floodplain deposits in which the archaeology is found. So if we take a closer look at what the section here looks like, this is the north end of the site. The site is some 90 meters plus long. This whole area was exposed by the Armenian military when they cut a road across the side of the gorge. And unfortunately, the floor here is either heavily mixed deposits from that road cut, or it's just completely archaeologically sterile. So all of our efforts for excavation were actually into the side here, which limited how much of the site we could actually recover without destabilizing that basalt above and creating a dangerous situation for ourselves and our students. So we have 5 stratigraphic levels that contain archaeology and some sub-levels within those. We do have levels below, but those are all archaeologically sterile. And then we have some dates, and these dates I'll talk about in a second. Some of them better represent different parts of the site, but this capping lava is dated to around 200,000 years ago, and the lava below the sediments at the site is dated to about 440,000 years ago, with a tephra date here in the first stratigraphic unit that contains archaeology at 308,000 years ago. Now, all of those dates are argon dates, as all of this volcanic material allows for us to date it that way. We also did try some infrared spectrum luminescence dating in the sterile units below the archaeology, but those came back oversaturated and give us a date of somewhere greater than 350,000, somewhere less than, infinity. So that's not very helpful. So here we see a drone image from the site from above after excavation was completed, and down at the bottom of the slide we see a digitized drawing of the entire section. And you may note we did actually dig down quite deep in some parts, and that's where we have some of these lacustrine sediments showing lake formation during parts of the Pleistocene. Now, for reasons I'm not going to get into for the sake of time, we do have 2 periods of sedimentation going on at the site. In the south of the site, we have what appears to be a marine isotope stage 11 alluvial set of deposits that probably date closer to that 440,000-year-old date. And in the north, we have what appear to be MIS 9E alluvium infilling a truncation. So we actually do have two discrete periods occurring at this site. And here's just a close-up of kind of the transition between these two areas of the site with that deep sounding. So if we turn our attention to the north end of the site, the younger part of the site, somewhere around 330,000 years, we have the 5 stratigraphic units with one of the subunits pictured here, and then we have that sterile unit 7A. And if we look at the technology here, there's a ton you could say about the technology, but I'm going to focus on the technology that helps us comment on the idea of new technologies arriving in the region. So in this first column, we have more traditional, classic, or not so classic, but we do have what we would call Acheulian hand axes or Acheulian bifaces, right, being very much Lower Paleolithic in character. A couple of these have really important features, though. These kind of large removals, what we would call large preferential removals, that are indicative of them being turned into these prepared-like cores. In the center column here, we have Lavawa cores. They're unmistakably kind of these prepared core technologies of the Middle Paleolithic. And mind you, these are not mixed deposits. These are just interstratified technologies that are interstratified due to their contemporaneous nature. We also do have some interesting early blade technology at the site that I'll gloss over. And then we have what I would call simple prepared cores. Now, unlike Lavawa cores, that there's a lot of preparation that go into these simple prepared cores are far less sophisticated. There's far less effort that goes into the preparation. Some people would call these proto, pseudo, or para-Lavawa, but I think that automatically assumes some kind of relationship, and I prefer to use simple prepared cores following Ashton and White to separate any a priori assumptions about its relationship. But it does seem like with these technologies all appearing together and being contemporaneous, that this fits better with an idea that there was experimentation happening here, and that Lavawa is the outcome of independent innovation in this region, as well as regions in Africa and other regions of Eurasia. Now, we've only focused on the southern end of the site in more recent years, but what we're finding is that it's actually a little different from the north. So we're looking further backwards in time at around 440,000 years ago. And we have 4 stratigraphic units here that contain archaeology. And here we can take a look at the technology again, and we have in these first 2 columns, these hand axes again, and there's a lot more variation in both size and shape of these hand axes during this earlier period. But again, we do have these pieces like this piece here that have large preferential removals at the end of their use life, where they're turned into these preferential like cores, almost mimicking Lavawa in a way. Importantly, we have no actual Lavawa from the southern extent of the site. Right, this seems like this predates the complete innovation of Lavawa technology, but we do have more abundant use of these simple prepared cores that, again, they don't have as much preparation, especially in terms of maintenance of distal and lateral convexities, but they are prepared in a way that is approaching Lavawa in many ways and approaching other Middle Paleolithic prepared core technological types. So in 2014, the north of the site was published on by my advisor and colleagues, in which the argument was made that this site does represent a transition instead of the replacement scenario, and that we're seeing independent innovation by the hominins in the Southern Caucasus of Middle Paleolithic technologies. And I think now with our increased understanding of the South that we'll hopefully be working into publication in the coming years, that it further drives that home that we have these two components with early experimental things happening in the south with both these simple prepared cores and these biface cores. And then in the north with some of that still going on, but also Levallois proper occurring, right? So here we're arguing that a transition is taking place. So with that in mind of what's happening kind of at the end of the Lower Paleolithic, where we start to see the Middle Paleolithic technological repertoire kind of expanding within the Lower Paleolithic itself, I want to turn our attention to this big gap right before the timing of Norgary between Dmanisi and Norgary. It's quite a large chronological gap. And I think with how important Norgary is technologically for understanding ideas of in situ technological transitions, I especially want to better understand the Acheulian record of Armenia and the Southern Caucasus, and especially the Late Acheulian, right? What leads right into Norgary is especially of interest to me for contextualizing Norgary properly. So this leaves me with a lot of questions about the Acheulian record. And here on this map, I have a number of sites listed that have Lower Paleolithic technology at them. And some of these sites are just older than the Acheulian, or they appear older than the Acheulian. Work's still ongoing at them, but Hatanak, Arabnatun, and Arni are all sites that seem to be closer in age to Dmanisi, and I'll mention those sites again at the very end. But most of these other sites all suffer from one issue or another in helping us better understand the nature of the Acheulian, with sites like Karakach and Curtin appearing not to actually be archaeological, but have been argued to be archaeological. They look more like rolled cobbles. And when we do see what looks like archaeology at these sites, the associated dates are usually not at all actually associated really with the artifactual material. And then you have sites like Dashadam 3 here in the north that has argued to be a late Acheulian site, but there's also a lot of mixing here, especially with Middle Paleolithic deposits and even Bronze Age deposits all deflated into the same stratigraphic level. So their utility for helping us better understand the nature of the Acheulian is very limited. Now I do have the site of Hatis 1 here, and its location relative to Norgary listed, and Hatis 1 is something I'm going to be talking about. So I have a lot of questions about the Acheulian, generally what it looks like in this region. Is there continuity between other Acheulian sites and what we're seeing at Norgary for that transition, right? These transitional elements that we see at Norgary, do we see those earlier? And how early do we see them? And then how does the behavioral sequence and the technological sequence in Armenia compare to other regions in Eurasia, such as the Levant, which is far better studied? So it's with these kind of ideas in mind that we can turn our attention to the site of Hatis 1 in central Armenia. So here's a view of the excavation going on at Hatis 1, our renewed excavation, I should say, of Hatis 1. This site is situated on the southern slopes of Mount Hatis, a volcano. It was discovered in 1983 along with 9 other localities, surface localities. This one had subsurface excavation completed in 1983, in which a 2 by 2 meter test pit was dug down to about 1.5 meters by Gazarian. In a short report on this site, Gazarian described 5 stratigraphic levels at the site, and he makes the claim that among these 5 levels, there are 2 very distinct phases of the Late Acheulian. Now, he does not describe what that means, but he says they're definitely there. Now, problematically, he also says that across the 5 levels, the assemblages are also largely homogeneous, which is a problem because you can't have it both be distinct phases and be homogeneous. So that's something I'm kind of interested in revisiting. Now, this was never published in full. In fact, what I've put up on the screen now is the entire publication of Hatis 1. It's shown up in some other publications, but it's just regurgitation of what's written here in Russian, in which he describes the layers. He describes he just says that there are two phases of the Late Acheulian. He says they're homogeneous. And he also tells us, he recovered 2,100 artifacts, 420 of which were hand axes. And that's all this report contains. So we're left with a lot of questions about that material. Now, most of that material is lost to time. We were able to recover a full 13 pieces from that original excavation that were housed at the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Yerevan. But in 2004, this landscape was revisited by a surface survey work. And this surface survey work was highly selective in what was collected. And based on that highly selective collection, two important claims, or the claims that stuck out to me, were made. One, that all of the Acheulean sites on Mount Hatis are workshops for the creation of hand axes and other tools. And the second claim being that the raw material available to the hominins imposes shape restrictions on artifacts, especially imposes restrictions on what shape the hand axes are. Which leaves me scratching my head a little bit, because the raw material here is very abundant and very large. So these are things I wanted to revisit when we revisited the site in 2016 and 2017. So the kind of focus of this work was to locate the original excavation, which was quite easy. It was well known by our Armenian colleagues. It was never backfilled. Which means there was a lot of profile collapse over the years that we had to clean out. And we also recovered all the artifacts from that profile collapse, because even though they're not in the strat themselves, they still give us some technological information about what's going on here. We also wanted to reestablish the stratigraphy. So what we did, and what you can see in this picture, is we excavated the western wall of the original pit half a meter back. Some other goals we had was to determine the dating potential, or if there was anything we could use to constrain the age of the site in time. And then, of course, collect the artifacts from both the infill and the strat themselves for analyses. So what we're seeing here are the clean profile at the end of the excavation, and a digitized drawing of that profile. And the first thing that might stand out is that, unlike the 5 reported stratigraphic levels, we actually have 7 and 1 sublevel here. And we only went to the same depth that Gazarian originally did. Now, some of the differences are very hard to notice, so I could definitely see why you might see 5 here. Starting from the bottom, we have 7A here. This is a pumice conglomerate that was likely deposited as the consequence of kind of ash flow from a volcanic eruption. And it's impossible to dig through. It's very, very difficult. And on top of that, Unit 7, which is our first unit that contains archaeology, is the weathered surface of that pumice conglomerate. Now, all of the rest of the levels above that are all colluvial slope deposits. They're all deposited by slope action. With Unit 6 here being deposited by high energy slope action, likely from a debris avalanche during volcanic eruptions. And then the rest of the units above that are all low energy colluvial deposits with a weakly developed A horizon in a newly deposited slope deposit at the top. Now, we did not recover any samples suitable for direct chronometric dating of the site, but there are actually some factors we can use to constrain the site that I'll talk about in a bit. So here, just to turn our attention to kind of the process after the fact, and to give a shout out to our field school students who are invaluable in terms of the work that we do here. We see some of our field school students from UConn's study abroad program cleaning artifacts under the supervision, or supposed supervision, I should say, of 2 of the grad students. Now, all of our artifacts from Hatis are treated with hydrochloric acid to remove heavy carbonate buildup, because as you can see in this photo, they're illegible unless you actually remove that carbonate. These artifacts are then PXRF'd by Ellery Fromm so that we get an idea of the location that the hominins are procuring their stone from. And then most of the assemblage is, and most of the Hatis 1 assemblage is 3D scanned by myself or student volunteers to be used as part of ongoing projects. Now, when it comes to the analysis of the lithic material itself at the site, I try and use a mixture of both more time-tested traditional methods and more kind of cutting-edge methodology to both get a better sense of the variation that's occurring within the stone tools, but also to allow for greater ease in comparison with other people's work and with future work both within and outside of the region. And this goes especially for what I call the long core tool component of the site, and this is what you would more traditionally call a hand axe or a biface, but I use Shay's terminology here, long core tool or LCT. And I use 3 specific methods for dealing with these LCTs and understanding the technology and variation. And the first is the Western European Acheulian project method, in which I'm looking at technological criteria within them, such as edge angles, retouch sequences, shaping strategies, depth of retouch, and other technological features like reduction indices. The second methodology here listed under the long core tool component is boards, metrics, and indices. And this is the more traditional typological analysis of biface variation. Of course, I use a modified version from Goran Inbar and colleagues that was used at Gesher Beno Yakov, the well-known Acheulian site there. And then the last method I use is landmark-based 3D geometric morphometrics, which I'm not going to go into detail on this method because it would take the entire time. But suffice to say that I use these 3D scans to better understand shape variation by removing characteristics like size, position, and orientation. So if we look towards the results of the analyses, here we have the raw material results, and unsurprisingly, it's almost exclusively obsidian, with only 3 pieces produced onto site, and all 3 of those pieces are those LCT hand axes, but the rest is obsidian. And here on this map, we have a number of the major obsidian sources within Armenia in red, and we have Hatis 1 labeled in blue. And perhaps also unsurprisingly, 100% of the obsidian that we analyzed with PXRF comes from Mount Hatis, which makes a lot of sense. Now, we can actually break down where on Mount Hatis the hominins are getting their material thanks to Ellery's hard work. So here we see an aerial view of the mountain itself with the site located here. And the different obsidian sources in these colors. And 98% of the obsidian that was used at the site comes from this close by source to the north and to the east of the site, the alpha source, with a much smaller percentage, just below 2% coming from the gamma source, just a little bit further to the northeast. Now, while giving me some idea of how they're using these sources, it also tells me that when this material was deposited on the surface before becoming incorporated in the slope deposits, that it was probably not too much further to the north of where it is now. It probably didn't move a whole lot since they're using those 2 nearby sources. So just really quickly, an overview of the assemblage. For one reason or another, I had to kind of put some of the artifacts into analytical units from different strata from the very top of the excavation. But some of the other strata were more easily defined, and therefore the provenience was easier to understand. And then I have the XC2 material, the stuff from the profile collapse, labeled as D here. But there's absolutely really no difference between any of these assemblages. They all contain the same kind of technology. So I will say that the idea of distinct phases of the Acheulian seems a little far-fetched, and the homogeneous nature seems a little bit more appropriate. Now, the condition of these pieces, most of them have ridge wear and edge damage indicative of being rolled, which makes a lot of sense with slope movement, colluvial deposits. And almost every piece has some degree of patination, some with very heavy patination, which to me suggests that these spent a prolonged time exposed on the surface. Now, in terms of composition, the debitage makes up most of all of these assemblages, with some diagnostic materials in lower quantities. So if we turn our attention to the technology present at the site, we have a number of core technologies present. We have core on flake, or kumbewa in the most lax sense. It's also called Janus flaking in North America, I believe, with removals of new flakes from the original ventral surface of very large flakes. We also have multi-platform polyhedron cores, which are very expedient. We have one very kind of classic Lower Paleolithic discoid core, not like the more refined cores found in the Middle Paleolithic in the discoid category. And very importantly, even though in very low quantity, we do have a couple of these simple prepared cores like the ones we find at Norgary. They're just there's only two of them in the overall assemblage here. Now, in terms of the debitage, it pretty much matches what we find in terms of the core technology and the other technologies at the site, with some elongated pieces that are triangular in cross-section that seems to be suggestive of some kind of blade-like technology, but there are no blade cores to make that judgment call that it is blade technology. And then we do have retouch tools, most of them being scraper types, produced on usually thicker pieces, large pieces, with very steep angled retouch, which is actually very similar to what we have at Norgary 1, but it's also very similar to what you get in the Late Acheulian of the Levant during both the Late Acheulian and what's called the Acheulo-Yabrudian. So I'm going to skip over most of the attribute analysis, but I do want to mention the size of what's going on, because I think the size at the site of flakes and tools is really important for understanding what kind of Acheulian we're dealing with. So we have most of the retouched tools and the cores produced on flakes are produced on flakes that are larger on average than those that are not retouched. These aren't statistically significant observations, but I do think this is a qualitatively interesting observation, especially because the abundant use of large flakes at the site. Right, and this I'm using the definition of greater than 10 centimeters from Kleindienst for the category of large flakes, where 46% of the assemblage is in terms of complete flakes and artifacts like the cores on flakes and retouch tools and even hand axes are large flakes. And I believe this allows us to include this assemblage in what's called the large flake Acheulian, as defined by Sharon, 2010. As this assemblage fits a lot of the criteria, I wish I had time to go into all of the criteria, but it doesn't fit all of the criteria, but I think it fits the criteria in really important ways, like the large flake use, and things like these hand axes being produced largely on large flakes, where we can see the original ventral surface here of this flake in red. And the ways that it doesn't fit the large flake Acheulian, I believe, is largely a consequence of the abundance and accessibility of raw material. So if we turn our attention, and this is the last thing I want to mention about Hatis, is the long core tools, or the bifaces, right? This is what makes Acheulian the Acheulian. I'll try not to go too in depth into this because this is where I feel like I will lose a lot of people. But using the more traditional analyses of boards, using 4 different metrics that round down into 2 different indices, we see that typologically they fall mostly into ovate categories and cordiform categories, with one outlier that's subtriangular. And here we just have some 3D scan examples of what the shape of each of these categories looks like. So not to get too much into my passion in life, which is 3D geometric morphometrics, but I wanted to further test if these typological categories were meaningful reflections of the shape of the tools using more modern methodology. And essentially what the output of this analysis, once it's run through principal component analysis, is that we have these groups actually cluster into their traditional typologies, with ovates here in purple and cordiform pieces here in gray, with that outlier more closely related to the cordiform pieces. And through a number of different methods, right, I've determined that these 2 principal components are relevant for further statistical analyses. And that the difference between these 2 major groups at the site is statistically significant, right? These are statistically significant shape groups with a P of 0.0008147. So then the question is, what's driving the difference between these different shapes of hand axes at the site? And the first thing I always think about is reduction, right? How maybe pieces are just more heavily reduced than the other. That's kind of the go-to explanation for what the variation in the Acheulian is based on, kind of from Shannon and Dibble's work. But here I've applied Shipton and Clarkson's scar density index to look at the amounts of reduction that these pieces have undergone, and they're reduced essentially the same amount. There's very little. There is some variation, but it's not significant. So then I want to turn to production strategy, because I don't buy raw material as an explanation holding back the shapes of these tools. So here I use that WEEP method, that Western European method, using a one-hot encoded principal component analysis of my technological observations. And then running that through right, principal component analysis, and then running that the first 5 principal components, and I won't get into why exactly I've done that, but running that through linear discriminant analyses here, and essentially we do have a slight significant difference between these 2 groups again. So this is based on the technological criteria. They still group into the same groups of ovates in red and cordiforms in black. And the main differences when I look at what are called loadings of my principal component analysis between these 2 groups are things like the type of blank that we're able to identify, the shaping strategy of the distal end of these pieces, the number of removal sequences, individual removal sequences, not overall reduction, and things like the depth of removal really explain what's happening here. So we have what I believe is a continuum of shaping strategies that are applied to create this continuum of shapes, and that it's not, the shapes at the site are not a consequence of the raw material. And the last thing I want to mention about these core tools, these long core tools, is that much like Norgary, we do have a few pieces with preferential core-like removals that are verging on prepared core-like technology. Right. So again, this is something that I think is really interesting, especially relative to the side of Norgary 1. And just to summarize what I believe is important about the site of Hatis, and I promise I'm almost done, is that it is late Acheulian in character, especially when we look at areas like the Levant in comparison. It is very typically late Acheulian. It is possibly that this site is a workshop location for the production of large flakes to then be used as hand axes, as retouch tools, as cores, and the like. And I believe, right, this is a regional variant of the large flake Acheulian that I mentioned, and that the variation itself is a consequence of the abundance and accessibility of raw material right by the site. And I think that really that raw material accessibility heavily defines everything going on at the site, except for the shape of the tools. I do believe that the continuum of shaping strategies, these kind of learned behaviors that are socially transmitted between generations, right, that these are what are causing kind of the variation in shapes that we see. And I do think with this kind of peppering of simple prepared cores and hand axes turned into preferential cores, that we're seeing early stages of a technological radiation, or right, an expansion of the technological repertoire of the hominins in this region that becomes more fully established by the timing of Nor-Gary 1. Right. So I said I'd return, of course, to this question of chronological placement of the site. So based on some argon, potassium argon dates of the Gegum range, which Mount Hatis is part of, we can say that Mount Hatis itself formed after 700,000 years ago. And that, of course, the subsequent obsidian that was available would have also formed after 700,000 years. So it cannot be older than 700,000 years. And if we compare it to what's happening at Nor-Gary, right, this is far more traditionally late Acheulian in techno-typological composition. So comparing it to, especially to that older date at Nor-Gary of 440, I believe that this composition at the site is older, or that this is older than what's happening at Nor-Gary. So I do think we could say that this is younger than 700,000 years ago and older than probably around 440,000 years ago. But we can't get more precise than that currently with what we have, which still leaves quite the gap in the Lower Paleolithic record. Which turns me to the very last thing I want to comment on briefly, which is the future of the Armenian past. So this is a number of projects that have either started recently or are getting started, hopefully when travel is available again. With this first project being our project in which we've moved to the north of Armenia, focusing on geological work and archaeological work, especially at the sites of Hatanakh 3, in which we have very Oldowan-styled core and flake technology at this very large site. And then my excavations of Futavan 4, also very close to the site of Hatanakh, which is very typically Middle Paleolithic, and I'm currently waiting on some OSL dates to come back from that site. This project also involves a lot of survey work, which is what you can see a number of us participating here in the demilitarized zone between Armenia and Georgia. The next project I have listed is my dissertation project, or at least what the NSF decided to rename my dissertation project for me, Factors Which Underlie Long-Term Cultural Change, which is funded by the National Science Foundation's Dissertation Research Improvement Award. And what I'm doing with this is I'm using this kind of 3D geometric morphometric methodology along with traditional methods of analyses to look at 5 sites in the United Kingdom and 5 sites in Armenia, kind of that straddle the lower to middle Paleolithic boundaries to try and better understand what's happening in terms of transition versus replacement ideas. The third project listed here is a project I recently joined led by Phil Glauberman of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Yerevan, in which we're visiting some of these sites I mentioned on a map earlier, RNE1, RNE2, and Aravnatun, with RNE1 and 2 being further south and Aravnatun being in central Armenia. And these also contain evidence for Oldowan-like technology, so very early basal Paleolithic technology. One of these sites also has faunal remains that can help us better understand things like the environment during the timing of these early occupations. We have some pilot funding from the Gofella Renaissance Foundation to start work at these sites. The fourth project here, the Trans-Cause project, is led by Ariel Malinsky-Buller of Hebrew University, formerly a postdoc at the University of Connecticut. He's a close colleague and friend of ours who is working on Middle Paleolithic sites after 250,000 years ago. And this last thing I want to mention is a collaboration between us and the Max Planck Institute in Germany, in which we're trying to recover hominin DNA from soils at some of our cave sites, using kind of cutting-edge methodology, which is the sampling process is what you can see Monica Knoll here doing, Brandon Zincius and myself, all taking samples for this type of analyses. And we do have some really exciting results from this already that I am sworn to secrecy on, which is unfortunate, but hopefully in the coming months, you'll see a product of this published. And with that, I want to very quickly thank a lot of people, and this is not even the most comprehensive list of people that I could thank in terms of what goes into this research, but I really want to point out especially our Armenian colleagues, but also the Partevium family, who have been very hospitable and put us up so many years. The employees of Hotel Zor that put us up in the north of Armenia, who are just very generous and very hospitable. And the local Armenian communities in which we work, who often work on sites with us, provide transportation for us, and really they are the ones that make this research possible, and without their efforts we would be absolutely lost. And I'd also like to thank you guys for listening to my talk. Hopefully I didn't keep you too long.
Well, that was
I think my. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Well,
we can go into questions.
Yeah, that was awesome. I don't really know much about early hominins and such, but I think that one thing that I'd like to hear and question that I had kind of throughout this is, what kind of implications does this model have for what we know about, the difference between early hominins and modern humans and the interactions between them?
Okay, so I assume you're referring to kind of these this idea of a transition or a replacement, correct?
Right. Yeah, and I guess really I'm kind of getting down to what might this say about the cognitive abilities of these early hominins related to or compared to modern humans is probably a better way of saying it.
Gotcha. So what I think, one of the things that I could say in terms of what it means in terms of the relationships is, first, if we think of the replacement, then biologically speaking, the split between Neanderthals and modern humans would actually be much more recent, with the group that was responsible essentially for eventually leading to both of those categories migrating out with this technology, with the transition idea allowing for kind of a deeper split between Neanderthals and modern humans, as we can put that timing back further. In terms of kind of cognitive differences, especially with kind of the earliest modern humans that you see in Africa, I think the cognitive differences would be very low if we're accepting really either model between Neanderthals and modern humans, because both Neanderthals and modern humans, when we see them in the Middle Paleolithic and the Middle Stone Age of Africa, they're both using Levawa technologies. They're both using prepared core technologies, and it's really not until kind of the later Middle Stone Age and early Late Stone Age in Africa that you start seeing a lot more development within the modern human behavioral repertoire relative to what Neanderthals are doing.
Okay, cool.
I think we have some questions on the chat for you, Jason.
Okay.
Actually, we have a bunch of questions on the chat for you.
Okay, I can see these. So I guess I'll kind of go through these in order to the best of my ability. So why are there few Upper Paleolithic sites in Armenia? That's a fantastic question. It's largely, I think, because there hasn't been a big research focus on it, is one of the reasons, as there are a number of kind of surface scatters that you could comment on, and there are definitely more Upper Paleolithic sites that you could see in areas of like Georgia, compared to what we found in Armenia. So the one site that we've worked on, Solok, we only worked on briefly, but more work will be done on it by Tanner Kovac in the near future. So the proportion of known hominin sites that were naturally exposed versus human activity exposed, I think that's a really good question. I think, a lot of them are human activity exposed, like the Armenian road cut, but a lot of them are also, especially in the Razdan Gorge, are just kind of natural sections that are exposed that have been found by just kind of walking through. And I think another problem that we also kind of run into with sites is that there are a lot, especially the cave sites, have a crazy amount of overburden from later time periods that you don't really want to haphazardly dig through to get to these earlier components and disturb them a great deal. Actually, the site of Ardneri 1 in the south was started with the idea of finding the Paleolithic deposits there. But instead, we actually, the focus of that has been on things like early wine production and the world's oldest leather shoe, because there's so much overburden from those later periods. Do I speak or read Russian or other languages that are helpful for my work? I wish I read or spoke Russian or understood Armenian better. Right, I do have some ability to understand a little bit of Armenian and converse, not even converse really, but get some things across in Armenian, especially when we're talking with our hosts and such. But English is actually a really broadly and widely spoken language there, and there are a lot of English language schools in Armenia as well. And all of our colleagues usually speak fluent Russian, English, and Armenian, which is very helpful. We lean on our Armenian colleagues, Boris Gasparian, Soran, and Hike, and all of our other Armenian colleagues a lot, especially in terms of translation, as I got the translation of the original Russian text that I mentioned from our main collaborator, Boris Gasparian. Can I talk more about morphometric analysis? What features comparisons are you making? I'm interested in how you may normalize volumetric data. So yeah, I could talk forever about morphometric analysis. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at overall gross morphology with this morphometric, landmark-based morphometrics. I also sometimes only look at outline shape, but I'm kind of looking at all of just the kind of gross morphology to better understand what shape variation is going on, but then to also try and understand what is causing shape variation in things like hand axes and cores, and how the shapes of some of these products might be related. And in terms of normalizing kind of the volumetric data, kind of getting rid of that kind of size component of it, right? It goes through a process called superpercussive imposition, in which, right, essentially there's a centroid placed in the objects, and then there's measurements taken to all of the points that you've placed on that object, and then those are all normalized to each other, and size is completely removed, and you get centroid size as a measure that you can use in subsequent analysis if you want to understand more about some of these size differences that we have going on between these pieces. And during that process, you also remove rotation and positioning differences so that you're purely just looking at that shape component. And I mean, of course, I'm happy to talk more about morphometrics any day of the week. So the next question I am seeing is any temporal or stratigraphic differences in where the material from the different sources come from, i.e. the gamma source at the top or the bottom or scattered throughout. So that's a good question. So essentially, the small amount of the gamma source that we do have at the site of Hatis 1 is pretty much scattered throughout the different levels and the XC2 material. There's no real, like, they were using more of the gamma source later in time than earlier in time. It seems like it's pretty well scattered throughout. Yeah, I do think it's just a consequence because those sources are right next to each other. Like, you can literally throw a stone from one to the other. And maybe some of this material was actually being produced right at the source before becoming incorporated in these slope deposits that built the stratigraphic sequence. All right, so do the non-diagnostic items in the assemblage reflect the differences in the LCTs too? So I haven't done a lot with the non-diagnostic material other than, kind of the basic analyses. But essentially most of the non-diagnostic material in terms of how it might reflect on shapes and such of the material is, most of the non-diagnostic material is either kind of ovoid in shape or it is expanding in shape, with a lot of expanding pieces in shape that are easily reworked into a number of different shapes through that reduction process and production of LCTs. So I do think the non-diagnostic material, we can comment a little bit on it, but it doesn't seem like there's too much variation in that material that would overly explain much of the variation we see in the Handax material. So the next question I'm seeing, and if you want me to comment on any more on any of this stuff, I'm more than happy to, but is LOL at NSF, what was your original dissertation title? My original dissertation title was, it was something absolutely ridiculous. I'm pretty sure it was like many lines long. Yeah, I honestly can't even remember it off the top of my head now because it's been changed for the last year. But it was something along the lines of like transitions or replacements. What can 3D geometric morphometric analysis tell us about blah, 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 blah. So I definitely understand why they made it more public friendly, especially since, this information is available to Congress when they look at things like NSF funding. And it's all up and available for the general public to consume as well. So I understand them changing my title completely. It just kind of removes all of the regional and time period focuses when you reduce it that much. So we have another question that says, you mentioned a large assemblage. How many artifacts are generally found in a Pleistocene assemblage? How much we talking? In terms of the site of Lucerkert, we're talking about tens of thousands of pieces. It's very, very dense. I mean, when that site was excavated, there were 2 total stations going just to keep up with the fine densities. Some other sites, the recent Middle Paleolithic site I've been working on, Futavon 4, we recovered something like just 700 artifacts from the top 20 centimeters of 4 units. So it's fairly variable, right? In terms of density, Hatis 1 is quite low compared to sites like Lucerkert, where you have just unimaginable amounts of artifacts and everything in between. So it really is variable, which could reflect a number of things, such as the strategies in which we're recovering remains. It could also reflect just occupation densities if you buy into such things like that. The next question is, what hardware and software do you use for your 3D analysis work? So in terms of the scanners I use a Geomagic Capture structured light scanner, which is accurate down to 6 microns in terms of its ability to capture surfaces accurately. And I also recently, through my NSM funding, got a HP structured light scanner, which is much cheaper. And this one runs on white structured light, unlike the Geomagic, which runs on blue structured light. It's a very small difference, but it's generally as accurate for a lower price. In terms of the software I use all of the statistical analysis really is done in R. The R statistics using a number of different packages, such as Geomorph. And then I use actual dentistry software for my semi-automatic landmark placement called ViewBox. In which I'm able to create a single model of what I want landmark-wise to be placed, and then I can auto-apply it to many other pieces, saving me a lot of time. And I find that software, there are many different softwares, some of them which actually do the analysis for you too. I don't like softwares that do the analytical part. I like a little bit of control so I can tweak the variables and better understand what's going on and what I'm doing. But the dental software is fairly inexpensive compared to some of the other software options out there, and it's what I learned. I went and learned it during a class in Italy, of all places. Any botanical remains and how acidic is the soil generally? I would say the soil is very acidic. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but most sites don't have traditional botanical remains, but we do have someone working on the phytoliths from some of our sites, Johan Jarl, and we do have someone working on plant waxes that are left in the soils, and that's Alexander Brittingham. So we can, in some ways, comment on the botanicals once those are done, especially the phytolith approach. But really, from our sites, we don't really have any other remains that really come to mind. Yeah, and that is the last question I see. If anyone else has any other questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
I had one. Just to tack on with the R libraries, how computationally intensive are these analyses? Like, do you have to use distributed computing to get these done in a reasonable time?
Sorry, I couldn't catch the last part of the what?
Oh, sorry, my internet is terrible. Do you have distributed computing to get these analyses done?
No. So in terms of the computing power that's required for these R packages, it's not that high. Some of the early parts, like running it through this the Procrustes imposition, can, depending on the size of the data set I'm working with, can take quite a while. But I've never run into a situation in which it takes more than, say, an hour to process a very large set of landmarks through that. And that's usually the most intensive part of that of the R process that leaves you twiddling your thumbs is the Procrustes. After that, all of the data is simplified enough that the PCAs and stuff usually don't take very long. The linear discriminant analysis doesn't take very long, and the outputs don't take very long. And
no memory issues.
No memory issues, right? I mean, I do run 32 gigs of memory on the computers that I work with on these 4-core processors, but I've never really run into any issue. Well, I've run into some issues with scanning with memory because one of the scanners I use, it backlogs a lot of things. So I've had it where it just stops scanning, which is really unfortunate in terms of time. But in terms of the post-processing stuff, in terms of the R stuff, it's not a problem. Now, post-processing some of the 3D scans can also be very computationally intensive. But usually I can get this all done on laptops when I'm in the field in terms of the former stuff, and then the latter stuff back in the lab easily enough.
Nice. That's really cool. Well, anybody else? Last call. It's 8:40. Are we going to finish before 9? Okay, cool. Well, not hearing anything. I want to thank you so much, Jayson, for your awesome presentation. This was really fun.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I absolutely happy to have been. And I did want to actually say, you mentioned the Alice Hamilton Award earlier, and that's actually an award I got when I was an undergraduate that really helped me do some research. So I think that's a fantastic award to be promoting.
That's awesome. Any chance you might be interested in presenting at the annual meeting in October? I mean, virtually maybe.
I mean, if people want to hear me talk more about Armenia, I'd be more than happy to talk anytime.
I want to hear it out on more morphometric analysis.
I can definitely talk about more morphometric analysis. I have a lot of pilot study data that I could certainly talk about. That goes into some of these questions about how we get from things like Acheulian hand axes to Lavawa cores in terms of maybe them actually being related directly in more of a kind of evolutionary sense applied to tools.
Oh man, that sounds awesome. I wish we could have a workshop.
I also wish the times were enough so that we could do things like that as well.
For sure. Awesome. Oh, Becca says that Morphometrics got her dad off her back about getting an archaeology degree. That's legit.
That's great.
Oh, nice. Okay, well, with that, I think we can close. Thank you again so much, Jayson.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Stay safe.
Good night.
Bye.